Anyone who knows me, and certainly any of the people who ever worked with me on any of my films, knows that The Conformist is extremely important to me. And I'll get into the reasons why in a moment, but I would stress that unlike what I said about Wavelength, about it was the single most important film in my development as a filmmaker, that's not quite true of The Conformist, but in another way, it's even more important because The Conformist for me was like what Citizen Kane has been for many people. That's to say, the film that really opened their eyes to the potential of the medium. And certainly that's the experience I had when I saw The Conformist for the first time. Paradoxically, though, as a filmmaker, you wouldn't really see that much direct influence between The Conformist and any of my work. So what is it about The Conformist that was so important? Well, it was with The Conformist that I discovered design, particularly historical design. And anyone who's ever read any of my critical work knows that this is a very important issue for me. That said, there are a few minor influences on my filmmaking from Bertolucci. The most important of these is what I would call irrational camera movement. Now, Bertolucci is one of the masters of the moving camera, and like Max Ophuls, to whom he owes a debt, few people can equal what he does with the moving camera. What makes it interesting, though, which always fascinates me whenever I watch any of his films, is that, yes, he does a very elaborate camera movements, but what's really even more interesting than the elaboration is the fact that they usually occur in moments that you would not necessarily expect to have a camera movement, and yet at that moment they are absolutely right. But the really important thing that Bertolucci provided for me was the model of his collaboration with cinematographer Vittorio Storaro and production designer Fernando Scarfotti. They made several films together, and all of the films they made together have a presence that is equaled by no one. And I say that knowing that Storaro has done lots of great work and Scarfotti did work for other directors, but the three of them were together. They created something that is sort of the model of the Bertolucci style, but I think if Bertolucci were still alive, he would be happy to admit that it's not just him, it's what his collaborators brought to the work. And that in itself was really my introduction to design in the fundamental sense. Which is to say, as I've made kind of passing reference to in some of the other videos and in many of my criticisms, historical design, it often gets hung up on archaeological accuracy. And The Conformist, which was set in the 30s, does not fall into that trap. It definitely summons up an image of Italy and France in the 1930s. But it isn't so much because every bit of decor is right and every costume is right, whatever. It's rather the poetry of images, as Pauline Kael referred to it in her review of the film. That's to say that, yes, basically there is a certain basic accuracy, but it's not so much that you really worry about whether or not it's appropriate to that time. It's just that it all feels right. How do you quantify that? How do you objectify that? I would be the first to say I have no idea. And yet I would insist that there is something about his work with Scarfotti and Storaro that can't be equaled by anybody. On the other hand, though, it is an excellent model of using design in the broad sense to give more to the images than just their narrative purpose or their archaeological purpose. It's really a question of what just seems right for that moment. And that is really the gist of what I think Bertolucci has to offer as a filmmaker. Now, having said all that, I don't want to suggest that the period of the film is irrelevant or the fact that it's period design is irrelevant. Of course, it's set in fascist Italy in the 1930s, and in doing so, it introduced me to Art Deco. Art Deco has been my primary focus of style in the broad sense of fashion, overall architecture, and so on. Why? Well, it's partly the fascist angle, I'll be the first to admit that, but it's also just that what Art Deco provides is an interesting combination of modernist design and more decorative aspects of design. And thus, on the one hand, it feels contemporary or modern or machine-like, if you will, but at the same time, it has these very Baroque, very assertive details which catch your eye. And so there's the seductiveness, if you will, of making the hard edges of modernism softer a little by giving them these decorative contours. And that, I think, is almost a definition of what I do in my films. Not that I always use Art Deco style, but that same impulse to combine the austerity of modernism with sensual elaboration that makes it a little easier to accept and to digest. And so it is that totality that informs all of my work that makes me say that The Conformist is sort of underneath just about everything I've done in my adult filmmaking, certainly everything I've done since film school. So, Bernardo, thank you. And so, yes, thank you, Bernardo. And thank you for watching these videos and sharing this voyage of discovery for me. And maybe you learned a little bit about me as a result of it. I decided to bring this to a close partly because I just felt like there was a danger of just going on and on and on. There are plenty of films I could talk about that I haven't covered here. In fact, just before committing to only a dozen, there were two more that I was planning to record. And I decided now we'll call it an even dozen. So anyway, thanks again. And if you have any questions about any of the things I've raised, if you want to hear about some other films that I may have referred to, or if you want to read my book, or whatever, if you want to contact me, please do so. I'd love to hear any comments from you. And that's it. And these are the way I found myself at the movies.